Well, first of all, I want to welcome everyone. Thank you so much for coming. Um, I was saying earlier before quite everyone was here that I hope it's a little bit easier to be inside at one of these sessions on a day that's gray outside. But we're really excited to have you all here. A lot of people signed up for this session, which we think is a sign that you, of course, know about the importance of discussion for kiddos and their learning. And so we're going to get started. And the very first thing we just want to draw your attention to is that what Sharon and I decided to focus on in this presentation is really taking what we know works in the classroom, both from research and experience, and just thinking through with you how to modify it for the e-learning environment. So taking all the great things that you already do and really just giving that some thought. As you know, these sessions are being recorded, so we wanted to let you just remind you of that. And those recordings and the Google Slides will be available for you in the future, so you'll be able to access those. We also respectfully ask, as always, that you mute your mic. Actually, you're muted now, so if you could stay muted for the most part, that would be great. Just eliminates background noise. If you have questions or comments as we go, of course, go ahead and type those in the chat. That's part of the reason why we've got co-presenters for all of these, is that one of us can kind of keep an eye on the chat at all times. But if there's something that you want to ask or offer that you think can't wait, of course, unmute your mic and go ahead and interrupt us. We trust your judgment about that. And then lastly, we're going to stick around for about 10 minutes after the presentation. So if you've got additional questions or ideas that you want to chat about, please feel free to stick around afterwards. So Sharon, we can go ahead to the next slide. There we go. So as we mentioned, all sessions are being recorded. At the end of the session, we'll share the attendance and feedback form with you. I know a lot of you have already been to sessions and you're aware of this, but if this is your first one, you have to fill that form out to get paid. It'll just take you a couple minutes. And like I said, we'll paste that at the end. Be sure to sign up for additional sessions. You can find those all on the website. And also, as I'm sure you've seen, more emails are coming out with more sessions and topics from other Glenbrook offices. So keep an eye out for all of those great sessions. All of the GBS instructional coaching sessions are posted, but those additional emails have come out as well. So we encourage you to take a look at those. Actually, Sharon, if you would go backwards one just for a second. Before we get into the content and a little bit of the research that we'd like to start with, I just want to introduce us. Because we know not everybody might know us, and if this is your first session of the summer, you might not know who we are. So I'm Marshall Harris. I'm an English teacher at Glenbrook South, as well as an instructional coach. And joining me today is Sharon Sheehan. She's a math teacher and is also an instructional coach at Glenbrook South. And just so you know, especially if you work at North or off campus or in the district office, if you're not familiar with our role, as instructional coaches, we're colleagues, we're not administrators, but a big part of our job is to offer PD sessions, but primarily to work with our colleagues one-on-one, supporting them with things that they want to do in the classroom, improvements that they want to make, basically being thinking partners and planning partners for our colleagues. So if you weren't sure who we are, that's who we are. So now we'll dive in. So as has been the case with all of our presentations, we always want to ground what we talk about in research. If you've been to a few sessions, you've heard us talk about this, but I'll talk about John Hattie really quickly. If it's your first session with us this summer, if you've not heard of John Hattie, he's basically an international educational researcher. He takes the research done by other people around the world and brings together those studies to draw conclusions about what he calls effect sizes. And he literally looks at thousands of schools and classrooms, millions of students, and he looks at different types of inputs, things like home life, community, socioeconomics, but then he also, of course, looks at instructional strategies. And for each input into the classroom, he measures what he calls the effect size. And if you look at this kind of semicircle chart, you can see that 0.4 is right in the middle. And what John Hattie says is that a 0.4 effect size means that for any given input, the result is 1 year of learning in 1 year's time. But every time you double that number, what you get is an effect size that doubles the rate of learning. So if a given instructional strategy has doubles the rate of learning, the effect size would be 0.8. So we're going to show you kind of the first effect size that's related in Hattie's research. And of course, classroom discussion, which is the very thing we're talking about, is a 0.82. And so the idea is that as educators, if we implement classroom discussions consistently and with fidelity, that will double the rate of learning for kids. They'll learn 2 years worth of stuff in 1 year's time. And we just want to share one other Hattie effect size for this particular presentation. And that is the jigsaw discussion strategy, which has a 1.2 effect size, which means that if it's done consistently and with fidelity, 3 years of learning can happen in 1 year's time. And we will talk more about jigsaw as a strategy later in this session. We're sure a lot of you are familiar with jigsawing, but we'll talk about it a little bit and specifically how it might be useful in the digital space. So we have been looking specifically at research from Stanford University and Northwestern University as part of our preparation for the summer PD, looking at what are the best practices they're publishing for their professors. And one of the things that came up from both institutions that we wanted to just point out to you before we get into these strategies around discussion is that they very much advocate for the flipped classroom, which essentially means that in the asynchronous space for e-learning, that's where direct instruction is going to happen and homework is going to happen, what traditionally would be homework. So the implication is that instead of lecturing kids or going through Google Slides during synchronous session, you might record those and instead leave that direct instruction for the asynchronous space. And then to use the synchronous time for building relationships and community and having discussions where kids can grapple with material together. A lot of you do this naturally. A lot of you did this in the spring, but we thought it was worth pointing out that these two universities, renowned universities, are advocating for this approach. Obviously, the university student is a little bit different than the high school student, so it's not a perfect match to what we do, but it's just good food for thought. We also wanted to point out that, of course, there's overlap with all kinds of instructional strategies, but discussion, as you all know, is great formative assessment. We ran a formative assessment in synchronous sessions PD offering earlier in the summer. We're going to offer that again later in the summer. I think that's, let's see, I think it's July, oh, it's July 23rd. I lost the date for a second. So that one's coming up. But we thought that was worth mentioning too before we dive into the details of how to structure discussion. In addition, one more slide like this, the nuts and bolts of Zoom within the context of what we're going to talk about today. We're not going to get into the nitty-gritty of that. That would take up too much time. But don't forget, as we are sure you know, the district instructional technology team is offering sessions about the nuts and bolts of Zoom. So we encourage you to attend those and take what we discussed today and merge the two presentations to make sure you're feeling as prepared as possible. So let's get into discussion. Now, the three foundations of good classroom discussion that we just wanted to mention to you, regardless of whether it's in the classroom or in the digital space, is that good discussion needs to first have a sense of belonging and safety for kids, for them to take academic risks, for them to take risks in front of their peers. They've got to feel that they are safe in doing so. We are running sessions about creating a sense of belonging. One has run already, but keep an eye out for that later in the summer being run a second time. Another foundation for good discussion is to be attentive to Bloom's taxonomy in terms of the questions that you ask kids to discuss. And one really simple way to think about it, you can of course be attentive to all the layers of Bloom's, but one really easy way to think about it that we just want to remind you of is to think about open questions versus closed questions. Closed questions being ones that are easily answerable based on fact or short pieces of information, as opposed to open questions which are interpretive, which demand that students explain their thinking. And if you can be attentive to those two differences, closed versus open, you're just more likely to have robust discussions. And then the last foundational piece that we wanted to just remind you of is that scaffolding how to discuss for kids can be important. So not every kid knows how to jump into a discussion. And some of those kids, especially in the digital space, might need some scaffolding, some how-to. You might think about providing them with sentence stems, ways to indicate that they want to speak, because you can't take for granted that they will know, one, how to participate, and two, how to transfer the participation skills that they do have to the digital space. As with all of the instructional strategies that we're talking about in the summer, we want to remind you how important it is to establish expectations. And we've been consistently talking about these three realms of expectations: how kids act, how they talk, and then the space that they're sitting in when they're on video in particular. And so for discussions, if you're hoping that kids will be on camera, and to create a dynamic where it feels face-to-face as much as possible, it's going to be a good idea to be attentive to the expectations that you have for them around what their space looks like, in addition to how they act and how they talk. Obviously, these are just generic questions, and the answers to those questions are going to be different for each of you in different contexts, but we just wanted to draw your attention to these realms, as we always do. At this point, Sharon is going to move us into some tools and specific strategies around classroom discussion.
Thanks, Marshall. So we're going to start today by just jumping straight into a breakout room. This will be your team for the day. We'll do a couple of breakouts. But we would like you to introduce yourself and talk about your favorite approach to getting students to discuss in the traditional classroom. And you're just going to have about 4 minutes, so make sure you're kind of paying attention to time. I think there is a clock inside there. You'll see how much time we have left, and you'll get a 1-minute warning. But just make sure everybody has a chance to share and to say hello and to mention what their favorite approach is to getting people to talk in the classroom. So Marshall is going to send us to breakout rooms. If you've never been in a breakout room, you will see a button appear on your screen that asks you to join the room. And we'll see you back in 4 minutes. So thank you so much for participating in that first breakout. In each of our traditional classrooms, we hold a variety of discussions and small group activities as a way to get students to talk in class. And as Marshall mentioned, so as Marshall mentioned, that it's generally a good way is to think about what you want to do in the e-learning classroom is to think about what you already do, because it's very oftentimes that we can adapt it. So we are going to talk about 3 tools today, possible Zoom tools. We're going to talk about the chat, we're going to talk about the poll, and we're going to talk about the annotate feature. And we're going to talk about them in a way that we can use them in large group discussions, and we can use some of them in small group discussions, and we certainly can use them in the large group to launch small groups. So for a few minutes here, we're just going to stay in thinking about the large group, the large classroom discussion, and then later in the presentation, Marshall's going to take it back over and to talk about how do we do that in the smaller groups as well. So what are some of the pros of using those 3 functions? One of them is to get all students involved in thinking, because we can With those three tools, all students, so in your classroom of 25, all of them can be doing something at the same time. In this session, we're going to see, it's going to be a little crazy at times, we're going to see all 150 of us doing something at the same time. So it gets everybody involved in it and starts priming students' thinking. It's interactive for students, which they enjoy, and it can be kind of fun for them to do. It enhances the class discussion for some kids, particularly the chat feature. Some students like to see all of the different views coming in through the chat, and they like the excitement of that. It's fast paced and it can be interesting for some. It encourages questions because, especially through the chat function, they can ask questions and articulate things or that they maybe wouldn't ask you verbally. And we see that even happening today in our own chat. These three tools are embedded in Zoom. So if you use Zoom for your synchronous sessions, they're there for you. They take practice to use, but they're pretty straightforward in the end once you figure out, how you want to use them. And you don't have to use all of them on the same day. You can prepare ahead of time, particularly the chat the poll we'll talk about. It's easy to prepare ahead of time and then launch. And we can use the tools to encourage those who want to respond. So you wouldn't always have to ask everybody to respond. You could just ask for those who are interested in this time to respond. What are some of the cons of these tools? Sometimes it can be difficult to follow, particularly the chat for the teacher. Like right now, Marshall's monitoring the chat. There is no way I could be monitoring the chat, moving the screen and talking all at the same time. So that can be difficult on a teacher, but there are strategies for that because you could assign a student or ask for a student volunteer to be the chat monitor, and that would be willing to interrupt you when there was something important in there to say. Just as the fact that the chat is really helpful for some students and they enjoy it, it's distracting to others. So we often talk about the fact that you might want to think about telling students they're not required to read the chat because for some of them it's overwhelming. The poll usually has to be set in advance. Technically, it can be set in the moment, but it can be hard on the instructor to do that and run all the other pieces. And then the annotate feature, which we're going to talk about, the con is that you have to have your students load the app. So we have figured out that students on Chromebooks can use the annotate feature, but they have to have the app to do that. And directions for having students load that app are coming from the technology department. It's simple and it wouldn't be a big deal, but if you're going to use the annotate feature, you would have to have your students load it so that they have it. What can you use the results for? You can use it for motivating full class participation. So again, like I said, everybody can do it at the same time, which is not true in a large class discussion as easily, unless you're having them, yell out their answer, which you might at some points. You can use it to launch the full discussion. We'll practice that a little bit. You'll get a little insight in that today. I think it would be easier with a smaller group of a classroom size, but we'll do it so that we get a feel for it. You can engage potential volunteers to the large group. And you can break off, and Marshall will talk about this in a little bit, into smaller groups given the information collected in the bigger group. So we're going to try all three of these. The first one we're going to try is the chat. So before we do that, just to make sure everybody knows where that is, you can move this bar. Typically it's at the bottom of your screen, so it should be down there unless you moved it. There in the middle, there's a chat button, and we would like every person who's willing to participate to type something in the chat, and we want you to type in the answer to this question. What is your #1 tip for combating distractions when working from home? So I'll give you a minute and you try to watch the chat as well. Marshall is typing the question in there. But what is your #1 tip for combating distractions when working from home? And I can start to see the chat slowing down a little.
Some great answers in there.
Yeah, there are great answers. So, Marshall, what was a great answer that you saw?
I liked Ben Hussman's trying to get his wife to teach in a quieter voice. They both need to paint back their teacher voice. That's entertaining.
That's a great one. I also saw many about locking yourself in a room or shutting the door. I was wondering if somebody who typed some version of that in would be willing to unmute themselves and just tell us a little bit about why that works for you. Is there a brave soul out there who will demonstrate how the students can give their answers and then expand on?
This is Scott.
Oops.
Go ahead, Mary.
Yeah, I'll jump in. So I did something similar. I said organize my space so there would not be any of the distractions. I find some things I can't control, which are my dogs. They seem to know as soon as I'm in a meeting to start barking or creating problems. And so if someone has any way to control them, that would be great to know.
Thank you. Is there one more person willing to share any answer that they had about the way they found to combat distractions?
Well, I just put isolation as much as possible. Although every morning about the same time my granddaughter comes up, it always seems to be when we have the seminars and she wants to come sit on my lap. But really just kind of isolation. Sometimes I might go to another room and that's about it.
Great. Thanks, Jim. Thanks, Mary, for jumping in. So as you can see, in the large group, you can, and if you had 25 answers in there, you probably could pick some and you could kind of plan in advance what you're hoping the answers to your question that you posed were going to be. And you could plan out how you're going to call on different people or how you're going to get volunteers to participate in the class discussion. And of course, maybe, you know, they're more sophisticated than this question in the sense of they would have more to respond to and explain and further explain their answer than they would have put in the chat. But that just gives you a sense of what you can do with this tool. You can cold call on people if that's your style in class using your cards. Several of you use cards. You could ask for the volunteers and you can specifically name specific answers for which you're looking for the volunteer. Also right here, you could use this, and Marshall will talk about this later, but we could use this now to send people into breakout rooms. So that would be another option. Thank you for that. All right, let's try the next one, which is a poll. So a poll is going to pop up. Marshall is launching it, and we would just like you to answer the question.
Sharon, as co-host, are you seeing the results as they roll in?
I am not.
Okay. So just so you all know, as the host, I'm seeing the percentages of answers roll in as you all answer.
So thank you for that, Marshall. I was wondering where my work. So just to explain why people finish answering, only one person in the room can be the host. And right now, Marshall is the host because he's running the Zoom. I'm the co-host. I have certain things I can do, but there are certain things I can't do. And one of them is seeing the poll results. So I'm guessing, are the answers in, Marshall?
Yep, and I just ended the poll and shared the results. Emily White asked in the chat if the results are anonymous.
So you have a selection for whether or not they're anonymous. So in this poll, they were anonymous. I didn't check the box, but you can check the box and they're always anonymous to the group. But behind the scenes, if you wanted to know the student's answer, you would have a list that you could look at later. I don't think you would be able to manage looking at them while you're presenting. But you would be able to look at them later to see who answered what, if you turned that on. But they will never be visible to the group, which is a good thing. I'm assuming, Marshall, somebody answered other. Anybody answer any other?
There were 16 people who said other.
So I was wondering if one or two of the 16 people could unmute themselves and say what genre of book they like to read and what's fun for them. Scott, I see you popped up.
I guess I would read a science fiction book.
Thank you.
Or a French classic.
French classic. Awesome. Thank you. Any other one? Person willing to volunteer?
Hi, it's Stephanie here from Glenbrook North. I picked other because I would read young adult fiction because one of my best friends has a young adult fiction podcast. So I read along with her and then I listen to her podcast about the book, which is pretty cool.
Great. Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you,
You're
Scott.
welcome.
So that's the poll feature, and you can use it similarly to the chat where you can invite students to participate with you, ask for, like, based on certain answers. I could have followed up with someone who selected mystery, tell us the specific title. So you can use it in any way that makes sense to launch the discussion, but you got everybody actively involved for at least a minute or two. So the last one of these three we're going to look at is the annotate feature. And the annotate feature, before we try it, let me tell you how to use it. I believe at the top of your screen, you see GBS Instructional Coaches Sharing Screen. So next to it, there is a little button that says View Options. And in that list of view options, hopefully you have Annotate. So if you select that, I'm gonna move the screen. And I would like you just to put a little tick mark on your favorite color. So just put a little mark on the screen on your favorite color. But before you do that, you have to select Annotate from the top under View Options. And as you can see, you're seeing what people are marking. And this feature, yeah, you can do all kinds of crazy things with it and delete things. Put a star, I like the star and the hearts, the marks. So this feature, you can have them do all sorts of things. I mean, you could have something that you want them to annotate. You could be annotating a paragraph together as a class. You could be making some sort of drawing as a class. One feature we're not showing you specifically today, but it's basically the annotate feature, is when I launched Share Your Screen, and you're seeing my screen today, I could have launched a whiteboard. And the whiteboard is just a screen. It looks exactly like a classroom whiteboard, and students can type on it. So you could have them type any vocab word they weren't aware of that was in the unit or in the chapter, or who their favorite character was from the book, anything like that. And you can sort them. You could have them draw a diagram from biology. You can have them do all of that kind of stuff. But again, just to remind you, and you'll get some information from instructional technology, you'll have to have them to use that annotate feature, whether it's in the whiteboard or whether it's on a screen like this. You would need them to download the app. Our computers have it, but their computers do not.
Sharon, there are a number of questions popping up in the chat. Some people are having trouble finding Annotate. It seems like some people on their phones doesn't work. Some people are seeing that the option isn't there. I don't know how much we know about the tech nuances around why it might not appear for some people, but I thought I would draw your attention to that question. It might be something that just has to be asked in the Zoom nuts and bolts sessions.
Right. I think for anyone who, I think that's the place to get the very detailed answer. But because we have it turned on in our settings, if it's easy available on the machine you're on, it should have been in that location. But again, like we talked about, Chromebooks don't have it, the Pixels don't have it, the phones wouldn't have it. It would have to be you going through an app an app to do it. So you'd have to download an app.
Scott Field is just asking if you'll repeat the download instructions really quickly.
So the download instructions are, they're coming soon from technology department. And they're going to be written in, I believe, for students, so that you could just distribute the set of instructions that students would use to get the app. And it should be very straightforward, but those are coming. All right, moving on, so we have time. Marshall, since you're the host, I'm wondering, I didn't know about this. Can you clear the screen now? Otherwise, this will be a little crazy.
Great question. I believe I can. Hang on. Yes, there's a clear button.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah.
So I thought it stuck with the screen we were writing on, but clearly it goes with you until you clear it. So those are the three big functions in Zoom that you can use in classroom discussions to get your classrooms launched. Yes, but the kids keep doing that. We'll have to work on that idea too. I bet you can turn the annotate off when you're ready to do that. So I'm going to transition to Marshall. And Marshall's going to talk about the small group discussions for more small group discussions from this point forward. And Marshall, before you start, you might want to mute all.
Yes, I will do that. Okay, so as Sharon said, we're going to talk about small group discussions as well. Those tools that she was describing are great ways to jumpstart full class discussions. And of course, small group discussions, as we know, allow for opportunities for kids to have more intimate conversations and for more voices to be heard. Kids who might dominate the full class discussion, it just creates more space for more kids to be heard. Sorry, can you go back one, Sharon? And of course, small group discussions can be used in tandem with full class. So that's a common strategy that's used, of course, getting them in small groups. And then when they break into back into the full class, using those small conversations to start a larger conversation. And of course, we know that small groups can be used for mixed ability small groups or like ability small groups. And you all know all of this, but again, we just want to draw your attention to the notion that what we're talking about is taking the things that we already do well in the classroom and just thinking through how they can be useful in the digital space. Now, the power of Jigsaw, you might remember from the research that we shared at the beginning, John Hattie puts jigsawing at a 1.2, and so we're going to talk more about that as we go through as well. So, breakout rooms, some people had questions about them earlier. I just want to elaborate on a few things. So they're easily done very quickly if they are random. So when we put you in groups earlier, we actually just selected the number of rooms and that gave us the number of people that would be in each room, and then we put you into rooms, and we didn't think at all about who was going to be in rooms with whom. If you want to specifically designate which kids are in which rooms, that takes a little bit more time. You can prep that ahead of time in kind of the back room of a Zoom session. If you wanted to do it on the fly, that can be a little bit challenging, just like it would be challenging to do it in class on the fly. It just requires a little bit of clicking around. Some people asked about the teacher joining the breakout rooms, and you can do that. You can actually select a room and just pop in. But at this point, you can't see them all at once. So if you imagine yourself in the classroom with kids working in small groups, we all know about kind of standing near one group and maybe listening to another group or watching all groups across the room. You can't really do that. We know that RJ is talking to Zoom about that question. And We're hoping that maybe Zoom will develop that feature where we can see all groups at once, but as of now, it's not available. The kids can also invite you in, and if they have a question or concern, or they want to bounce an idea off of you, they can very easily, it's really intuitive, click one button and send you a message to say, hey, come into our room, please. And then you can bring them all back in at once. And you saw this when Sharon and I put you in breakout rooms earlier. You click a button, really easy to find, on the host toolbar, and it gives that 1 minute warning. And then at the end of 1 minute, everybody returns to the classroom. And that's kind of actually much easier and nicer than it is in the in-person space, because there's zero transition time. There's no movement around the room. You just click that button and then everybody's back. So you can use those Zoom tools to create the groups, just like Sharon showed you that you can use the polling and the chat and the annotating to call on kids or to get kids thinking and then talking in the large group. You can also use those same tools to identify kids who are feeling or thinking a certain thing, and then put them in groups based on that quick formative assessment. Like I said, it can be a little bit difficult to make the groups on the fly. So one thing to think about is when you're structuring a synchronous lesson, is can you put something in between? So maybe you use a Zoom tool, you gauge kids' understanding or their feelings on a particular question, and then you give them some independent task for a few minutes, and while they're working on that task, you organize the groups that you want to put them in, and then you put them in the small groups. Like I said, it's a little bit trickier than doing it in person, so it's a good idea to be mindful about what you might give them to do while you put them into groups. And then the other thing that we wanted to draw your attention to is that there are also emojis of different kinds. If you look at your bottom toolbar, you should see a reactions button. And if you go ahead and click that, there's only two there. You should see a thumbs up and kind of an applauding button. But you can use those two. And there are other ones that are in a different space. We're not going to show those to you today because we don't have time. But if everybody would either click the thumbs up if you are feeling good today, or the applause if you're not having a great day, that would be helpful. You'll be able to see people's answers. Thumbs up for your day is going well so far. Applause if you're not in the best of moods. There you go. So that's another quick way to see how kids are feeling, and then to potentially put them into groups. Now, once they're in groups, protocols for the structured discussion can be really, really valuable. So the idea that you give kids very specific structure for what they're going to talk about and who's going to talk and when they're going to talk, because of that limitation that you can't see all the groups at once. Protocols can be really valuable for that reason. When they're in the groups, you can copy and paste directions into the chat for them to see. So if you really want them to be attentive to certain steps, if you put that in the chat, it will go to everybody. You can also, there's a one button click that you can message all the groups, and a message will pop up. So if you're talking to one group and you're learning something about how kids are thinking about a particular discussion topic, and you want to make sure everybody, excuse me, everybody can learn from what that one group is experiencing, you can message all the groups. And then the whiteboards, a few people were asking about this when Sharon brought it up. They can be used in the small groups. And when kids return, they can show everybody what they put on those whiteboards. So imagine you're in a math discussion and you're asking kids to show their work in a small group. They can write on the whiteboard and then they can come back and show it. But the way they show it would have to involve a screenshot and then a screen share by them. They can't bring the whiteboard itself back. They have to take a screenshot of it in order to be able to share it once they're back in the the full group with everybody else. So Sharon, let's actually go to the other one because we're a little short on time. Thanks. So we're going to put you back in groups for another small group activity. What you're going to see, if this works well, hoping it does, is that you are going to be in the same groups with the same people. I'm going to copy and paste this question into the chat, just like I referred to, and I'm going to push it to you in a message so you can see what that looks like as well. And we're just going to ask you in your groups to discuss this question. In what ways do you feel at this point you can facilitate synchronous and or asynchronous discussions in your e-learning classroom? Thinking about specifically how to partner those two. What can you do to bridge those two types of discussion? What are you thinking about at this point? All right, I'm going to send you into breakout rooms with that question in mind. And everybody's muted. A couple questions that came up that we wanted to make sure we address for everyone to hear. So one group asked me to join their breakout room to see if I could see what they had been working on in the whiteboard, entering after they had already done that work, and I could. So you as a teacher, if you have kids working on a whiteboard, you'll be able to pop in and see what they're doing. Another group asked if the co-host can also pop into any room. And the answer to that, unfortunately, is that the co-host, him or herself, cannot. So if you're co-teaching a class or if you have an IA in your class, the way you have to do that is that the one host, the primary host, can put that person into different groups. But the co-host, him or herself, cannot select a group and just pop in, which is too bad. But as I said before, RJ is in communication with Zoom about these kinds of questions. Obviously, Zoom is dealing with probably a lot of school districts right now, but we can add that question to his radar. Can the co-host be someone who can pop in? We also wanted to mention that you can use lots of tools with kids within those small group discussions. You could have them work in a Google Doc, any other digital tools that you really like. You could ask them to do work in those tools, and they can share their screen and work together. One of the tools that we were thinking we might show you was Padlet. Padlet could be really useful in that small group discussion context. You could have kids having kind of a text-based conversation in Padlet that's live and cloud-based, and all of the other groups could then see what the other kids are typing in the Padlet all at once. So the very last thing we want to talk about is this powerful strategy of jigsawing. And again, it's got this Hattie rating of 1.2, which means that it's tripling the rate of learning when it's done well. If you're not familiar with jigsawing, although I'm sure most, if not all of you are, it basically involves two phases of groups. So if we took the groups that you were just in, and then we reconfigured all of those groups so that each new group has a representative from the first group, that would be very big groups. Then in that second group, you can debrief about what the first group discussed. So for example, if you bring small groups into the full class and everybody reports out, then everybody's hearing from each group. But if you jigsaw them and you put them in a second set of small groups, it just allows for more intimate conversation about what was talked about in the first groups. Now, part of what makes jigsawing so powerful is that every member of the group then becomes the person who's reporting out. There's no dynamic, and we're all familiar with kids doing this, where like one kid in the first group does all of the learning, makes sure he or she understands, and then does the report out, right? With jigsawing, nobody can hide because everybody has to report out to their second group. That's what makes it so powerful. And what we wanted to give you food for thought around with jigsawing, because it is such a powerful and frequently used tool, we know it's used a ton in our classrooms, is that it might be best used from one synchronous session to the next. because it can be really difficult to reconfigure those groups on the fly. So you might think about, for example, having kids meet, maybe you've got them on a Monday and you have them meet in the first group to end the synchronous session on Monday, and let them know when we reconvene on Wednesday, I'm going to jigsaw these groups, and then each of you will be responsible for explaining your group's thinking to your new group on Wednesday. One of the other advantages of doing it this way is that it kind of can build in the expectations that kids take notes on what they're discussing, or you might give them a graphic organizer to write about what they're discussing so that they then can still feel prepared in their second group on Wednesday. So, oh, look at that. It says presentation title goes here. That one. The presentation title, everyone, is Discussions in the Synchronous Space. As always, we are so thankful that you're here. For more support from the instructional coaches, if you work at Glenbrook South, there's our individual email addresses as well as our collective inbox. If you don't work at Glenbrook South, of course, the instructional technology team is there for you, without a doubt, to help, and you know about the resources in your own buildings.